Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Susan Poeton, innovator of content and publisher of Industry Today. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. Manufacturers is your outdated messaging costing you customers. Each speaker will share tips, tricks and exercises that you can take and leverage with your team. We hope by the end of the Lunch and Learn you will have the tools and knowledge you need to evaluate and improve your messaging to make it more effective for the long term. Before introducing our presenters and panelists today, I'd just like to go over a few administrative details. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see you have the opportunity for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please put your questions in and I will share those afterwards. If you'd be kind enough to include your name, that would be very helpful. There will be a recording of this presentation afterwards that we will be sending out, and we hope you'll join us for the after party. A link will be shared on the screen again at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce each of our presentation panelists. Our first presentation will be by Paul Kishi, President of Aviate Creative, a creative agency with an edge in manufacturing. Paul?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm very excited to be here today. And thanks Susan for hosting today.
Pleasure. And Jessica Clark, owner of the Content Creamery, a marketing agency specializing in content strategy and copywriting services. Jessica.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm also very excited to be here and looking forward to it.
Following Paul's and Jessica's presentation, we will have a panelist discussion with special guests, Todd Hockenberry, owner of Top Line Results, a consulting and advisory firm focusing on helping industrial and manufacturing companies grow. Todd.
Nice to be here, Susan. Thanks for the intro and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to the questions, looking for some great questions today.
And last but not least, David Caron, partner and CMO at IndustrialSage, an open platform where industrial companies can showcase their expertise and solutions to a captive audience of industrial buyers seeking solutions to their problems. David.
Hey everyone, super excited to be here.
Okay, I will now hand over to Paul and Jessica, and thank you again for everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate the opportunity to present. Manufacturers, is your outdated messaging costing you customers? Today's presentation is by Aviate Creative and the Content Creamery. Manufacturing companies have evolved. Whether your company is 5 or 100 years old, there's a good chance it has had to evolve, pivot, or adapt. This could be due to current events or just natural changes over time. Maybe some things have stayed the same, but every company is affected by change. Some companies choose to ignore that change, which causes your messaging to become outdated. This will eventually have a negative impact on your company. Now is the time to evaluate your messaging. Does your messaging reflect your current brand, or does it misrepresent your brand and cost you customers and more?
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the things that have actually changed for your company. So the first one that we have is products or services. Many times when we're talking with clients and reviewing their websites with them, they'll tell us things along the lines of, we don't even do that anymore. This is a huge red flag that your content is outdated. It's very important to make sure that your messaging reflects the products and services that you currently offer. Otherwise, you're just going to confuse your customers. Number 2 is market changes. So maybe your business is meeting the demands of today, but does your messaging reflect this? Otherwise, you could be losing traction in the market and not even know it. Number 3 is company personality. So where does your company fit within the context of 2020? How would you describe your company culture? These are things that naturally change over time, and it's important to make sure that your personality is relevant and doesn't seem out of touch. Number 4 is vision, mission, and values. So how have your goals changed through the years? Again, this is something that's very relevant for companies that have been around for a long time. Number 5 is new management and leadership. So, as we all know, new management often means new direction. So, does your messaging reflect the various refinements and processes that have been introduced to your company with new management? Number 6 is credibility and reputation. So, does your website say that you've been around for 50 years when you've actually been in business for 75 years? Are you failing to display certifications and qualifications that would otherwise put you ahead of your competition? If you're failing to do these things, you could definitely lose traction and, again, put yourself behind your competition. And last but not least, we have audience. So many companies have one target audience and it stays that way throughout their whole history. Other companies have several audiences, and especially with the current landscape, a lot of companies have acquired new audiences that they need to consider. So the question is, does your website address each audience on separate pages? Are you allocating separate pages in your print materials for each audience? It's very important to touch upon these individual pain points because each audience is going to have a different set of problems and needs. And to help with this, we're providing an audience evaluation worksheet that includes tips for targeting multiple audiences. So you'll receive this worksheet in the follow-up email.
So there are just a few reasons to update. One, you don't want to appear obsolete. It's important to stay relevant and grow into the future. Refresh your image and your messaging if you don't want to be left behind. 2, you want to increase sales. Not only will new prospects be reviewing your marketing, but current customers are always reevaluating whether to stay with you or to move on to someone new. Number 3, avoid confusing prospects by not having mixed, unclear, or old messaging. Reawaken customer and partner relationships. It's important to keep good communication with your customers and partners. They often only see a small scope of what your business does. Updating your messaging can spark new business, reawaken old relationships, and expand their view of your services. Number 5 is move ahead of competition. Everybody likes that. There's a good chance that your competition is also outdated. So the sooner you improve your messaging, the faster you'll push past them. Number 6, attract employees. A lot of people don't think about this part of it, but when you take your stuff and your employees are looking through your job description, your website, or your materials, they determine if your company is where they want to work. So you might be qualifying your employees, but they are qualifying you as well. Number 7, clear internal direction. When everyone on the team is on the same path, sharing the same goals, vision, and mission, you will see better results and a better team morale. And number 8, improve credibility and reputation and become a thought leader in your industry. So what should you be evaluating? Let's start with branding. It's at the core of your messaging, starting with your name, your tagline, and even your logo design. I wanted to share with you a sample here of something that we worked on. Now, this is the old logo of a company that was not only very outdated and generic, but after 100 years in business, they had completely changed their company and what they offered. So we started with renaming their brand and then moved into designing their logo. So Filer Mutual turned into this. Here's a look at their new name and logo. They are now True Leap Technologies. 100 years of innovation, ready for 100 more. True Leap is now leaping into the future with their new brand. So Jessica and I collaborated with Industry today on some articles, and here's an article we worked on, Has Your Branding Expired? This is very relevant to what I was just talking about. So we're going to share this link in the follow-up email that we'll send after the Lunch and Learn. Number 2, websites. If your site is outdated, missing products, lacking information, or is a poor representation of your company, it will discourage prospects and talent. So we wanted to show a site Jessica and I just finished. Hopefully that'll pop up on your screen. This is Norwal, manufacturer. You can see right at the top, we start with a really strong, bold headline. We move into a description of what they do. We establish their niche markets right away, their industries. Start tying in their differentiators like their strong customer service, And then we really want to start establishing credibility and build trust. So we have some statistics and a testimonial. And then we end on a really strong CTA. Right. Number 3, collateral and sales material. You will want to make sure that you and your sales team are armed with the latest and greatest materials. If your team has to apologize and make excuses because the materials don't represent what they are selling or they're outdated, they're going to be set up to fail. Here's an example of a sell sheet that Jessica and I wrote and designed for Aviate Matcha. They're a manufacturer of matcha tea. It's the powder, kind of like green tea, but it's really a matcha powder. Before working with us, they have a very sterile and laboratory feel. They wanted to reposition themselves as creative, culinary, and artisan to appeal to chefs and food and beverage companies. You also want to evaluate your exhibits and trade shows. Here's a look at Aviate Matcha again, and this is how we translated that messaging and positioning onto their trade show booth. You want to look at your promotions and advertisements. Number 6, your catalogs.
And next we have email marketing. So the whole point of email marketing is to stay in the minds of your customers and stay connected. So it's very important to ensure that your messaging is relevant and valuable. You can absolutely promote new products and services in your newsletter, but you just need to make sure that you're being strategic about it, meaning you're making the value and benefit for the customer very apparent and clear for whatever you're promoting. Number 8, presentations. Remember that you only get one chance to make a first impression, so make sure that your content for presentations is always updated and relevant. Social media. Social media needs to be constantly revamped because, as we all know, the platforms are constantly changing. You also want to make sure that you don't come across as tone deaf with outdated and pre-scheduled content. And Paul and I actually wrote another article for Industry Today on this topic. It's called Caution, Adjust Your Content Before It Goes Live. And in the article, we discussed the importance of reevaluating your pre-scheduled content and making sure that it's relevant and appropriate for the time. Okay, number 10 for what you should be evaluating, we have press releases followed by your blog. Make sure that all of your blog posts are timely and relevant for the customer. And lastly, we have internal communications. So you need to make sure that you're on the same page internally in order to properly communicate with your customers externally.
Thanks, Jess. So where do you start? We recommend sitting down with key decision makers within your company to determine a few things. You want to determine your target market, your customer personas, your vision, mission, values. You want to establish your why, your SWOT analysis. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You really want to figure out what makes you different. So you want to do your differentiators and your unique selling proposition. A lot of people don't think about this, but you really need to think about your company culture and your brand personality. This can help you connect better with your prospects and employees. And also, we have on your competition. A lot of people overvalue assessing their competition. This, to me, needs to be done, but don't get obsessed with it, and don't try and mimic your competition. If you're doing everything that we're talking about right, you're not going to have any issues with competition because you're going to differentiate yourself separately enough. What we did was we actually put together a couple different worksheets for you to do some exercises, and this is our branding positioning worksheet that you can use through this process. This will be included as a link in your follow-up email, so you can use this on your own time and figure out your brand positioning better.
Okay, so now that you know that your content is outdated and what you need to do to gather a better understanding of your company, what do you do next? How do you actually put the plan in action? So now I'm going to walk you through the actual writing process. So the first step is to complete a creative brief. In other words, it's the brand positioning worksheet that Paul just referenced. This is where you'll identify things such as your USPs, differentiators, all the things that are going to make it clear how you stand out. You want to make sure that you don't overlook this step. I like to think of it as back in school when the teacher had you create an outline before writing an essay, how much easier it was to actually handle the writing when you've already done the work beforehand. And the same applies with the creative brief. It's so much easier to do the actual writing when you've already identified what sets you apart. The next step is to actually get writing. So always write for skimmers, write in digestible bite-sized chunks. Keep in mind that your customers have very short attention spans and you don't want to overwhelm them with large paragraphs of text. You also want to make sure that you clearly address your customers' pain points and always show how your company is going to solve your customers' problems. And you want to let the brand voice always be your guide. So this is why branding is such a valuable thing, because it can do so much of the work for you. So going back to that Norwalt site that Paul brought up previously. So during the branding process, we established their tagline in the top left corner, the next evolution in automation. And that helped inspire the header right below, in the world of automation, efficiency favors the bold, where the word world ties back to the whole idea of evolution, makes it feel very organic, biological, really gives the impression that Norwalt has secured their place in the world of automation. And that's exactly what the brand voice does. It establishes your personality early in the process and makes it so much easier to tackle the writing and make your company stand out with your messaging. Okay, so the next step is to revise until it feels right. So some people will revise as they go, others will jot down whatever comes to mind and then revise heavily later. Personally, I fall into the camp of revising as I go, but do whatever works for you. There's no right or wrong way to do that. You also want to make sure that you don't try to please everyone. The more people that you bring into the writing process, the more likely you are to end up with safe, dry content that ultimately isn't going to do the job that it was intended to do. Number 4, you want to make sure that you implement consistently. So don't just apply this new messaging to your website. Make sure that you review your print materials, social media strategy, everything. Disjointed messaging is just going to confuse your customers and will negate all the work that you put into updating your messaging in the first place. Number 5, you want to make sure that you reevaluate and update frequently. So I like to treat messaging as you would a perishable food item, in the sense that it's going to be consumed and valued, but it definitely has a shelf life. So you want to make sure that you don't treat updating your messaging as a once in a blue moon approach. You want to make sure that you update it frequently so that your messaging will always have maximum impact. And now we want to add another poll. We want to ask you guys, what aspect of messaging and content do you find the most challenging?
Want to see if I can, oh, I have to end the poll before I can get your results to the other one. Let's see. This is what did me in last time. Hopefully we're going to be good here. All right. Jess, you want to continue on with the next slide for now, and then we'll end the poll and show the results later.
Sure. Okay, so I just wanted to share some more quick tips for rewriting, improving, and updating your messaging. So the first one is make sure that you always emphasize your differentiators. This is what's going to separate you from the competition. Next, you want to make sure that you reinforce with case studies, statistics, educational content, testimonials. All of these things are super effective because they're all proven. It's not just customers taking your word for it. You have the facts to prove your capabilities. Next, you want to remember that everyone loves a good story, so craft yours and share it. Stories pull people in. There's a reason why humans have been telling them since the beginning of time. Your story will show the more human side of your company, and it's going to earn trust and always keep your customers more engaged. Next, you want to make sure that you don't overlook grammar. Even if your industry has nothing to do with writing, you'd be surprised how poor grammar can immediately diminish your capabilities. So if you aren't the best with grammar, make sure that the content is at least reviewed by someone who has a better knack for it. And lastly, Always avoid generic statements. So again, this is the beauty of branding and building your brand voice, because it's going to naturally help you avoid cliches and generic statements in your messaging.
All right, why don't we end the poll and see what we have here. So the second poll that we just talked about, we have 55% for the first answer, understanding what my customers really care about. 23% on putting everything into words, I'm not a writer, and 32% for keeping messaging consistent. And if we go back to poll 1, I think I can look at that. We have a whopping, so the first question was, where do you feel your messaging currently stands? And we have a whopping 85%, it's relevant but could use improvement. 11% is it's right where we want it to be, and 4% is I'm not sure. So thanks everybody for taking those polls. All right.
All right, so to conclude, you want to make sure that you don't use your company history as a crutch. Many manufacturers fall into this trap because they've been around for a long time, but if you do this, you're definitely limiting your potential in the market and you might not even know it. Make sure that you can always back up anything you say in your messaging. Always make sure that it has true value. If customers get even the sense that you're embellishing anything or not being authentic, they'll immediately lose trust in you. And now is the time to capitalize on this period of reinvention. So companies across every industry have been reinventing themselves and will continue to do so. So the question is, are you going to revamp your content and hit the ground running, or hold on to your outdated messaging and sell yourself short?
Updating your messaging will eventually become essential. So don't wait until it hurts your company. If you have the time and internal resources to do this, make it a priority. If you don't have the resources and time, work with professionals that know what they're doing and get it done right. So we just want to thank you for joining us in our presentation. Please stay on as we have a panelist discussion next, and then we have Q&A and so on. So this is not the end of the Lunch and Learn. I'm Paul Kishy from Aviate Creative. You can find us at aviatecreative.com or on social media under Aviate Creative or my name.
And I'm Jessica Clark from the Content Creamery. You can find us at thecontentcreamery.com or on social media under the Content Creamery.
And now we'll switch back off the presentation and go back to Susan for our panel discussion.
Well, thank you both very much. So we're going to have a panel discussion, and I'd like to start with Todd. Technical issues aside, what were your thoughts on the presentation?
Well, I love the topic. It's incredibly relevant because if you haven't noticed, most of the first impressions you have from all of your prospects come from online. The vast majority of first touches come from digital content of some form, whether it's social media or certainly your website. So that first impression is really important, and that's your messaging, right? If you're talking about product and I make this and here's a picture of my factory, and not talking about the person who's looking for you in their terms with their types of language, then it's very easy to click to the next website, because competition is all the 50 other competitors that they find when they search for your company. So I think the topic is incredibly relevant, and I love the content. The worksheets and the practical steps were great.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I think that when you touch on branding as a whole, we look at the kind of new landscape in that Google put out a study 5 years ago where 50% of B2B buyers are now millennials, and they're in tune with how your brand looks and feels. And so that impression that we're talking about that's being formed, they might not be per se the decision maker, but they're the ones that are taking that information and putting it in front of those decision makers. So if your branding is off, it's the details of what we went through today is right in there, exactly what needs to be done.
Thank you. So David, let's continue with you. Has current events impacted messaging for manufacturing and shed a light on outdated messaging?
Well, I think that everyone feels the need to respond in some way. There's a lot of different things happening. We can call out current events now, but even in the future, there's going to be times where people need to make a statement. And this is something that the messaging that you have when it is outdated, it's really a poor reflection of your organization. So when you're putting out a message that is inaccurate or referencing content that's outdated and old, it's rather embarrassing. So now more than ever is really the time to be able to really update the message, update your branding. That way you're able to put your best foot forward when you're making these different statements.
Thank you. Todd?
Well, we see with our clients, we've seen a lot of requests for should we send out the COVID email? Should we put the banner on our website and things like that? And I think there was a time for that, but I think that time's passed. And what we've really been recommending people do is to understand who their prospects and customers are and whether they're in one of three modes. Are they in thrive mode? I've got clients that are just doing great in the last 3 months because they're in critical industries. They've seen a lot of demand. And then there's other clients that are kind of more maintained. They're just trying to stay where they are and keep their current clients. And then you've got other companies out there that are just trying to survive. So you've got to know who you're talking to and message to them in their situation. So it's much more impactful if your messages say, we know you're in a tough industry. We know you're in a tough market. Here's how we can help you keep your doors open, keep your customers. And if they're in a thrive business, here's how we can help you make sure you're going to take advantage of that. So you've got to really know where your audience is and message around that. Because the number one thing for messaging for me has always been, it's got to be in the customer's point of view, right? It's got to come from their point of view. They got to understand it. It's got to be in their language, in their terms, about their issues and their outcomes. So as long as you're doing that and you're matching it up, I think you're going to be successful. If you don't, I think this is a time where a lot of people are online looking and searching and looking for answers. And if you're just talking about product or you're talking about the same old thing, it's easy to, like I say, it's easy to ignore you.
Okay, thank you. Let's continue with Todd. What are the negatives and positives of updating your messaging?
Well, the negatives are if you're selfish, essentially, if you're not being human, right? If you're not talking person to person and you're kind of using automated marketing speak, right? If you're using things like best practices and high quality, if you're using vague terms that really don't mean anything, you can hurt yourself. The positives are, I think you show empathy. You show that your audience, that you understand them. And I always tell our clients that your salespeople and your marketing people should know as much or more about the issues your target audience has than they do, because you should be talking to lots of them. You should be talking to people across the spectrum, and you can bring a different perspective, real business insight to your clients. And you need to start with your messaging to get them to say, oh, that's interesting. I want to learn more about that. If you're just talking about your product and your equipment or your service, it's not super interesting to me. So I think that's the challenge, right? The challenge is to stay out of your own head and get in your customer's head, and then use your messaging to drive the right fit prospects. Right? That's the idea of omitting people in your messaging, I think, is a critical one. You should tell people who you don't work with, who you don't help, that's not a good fit. I mean, you don't waste your time or their time by saying something you're not. So I think those are some of the risks. But the positive is, again, I think there's a lot of attention in a lot of market segments, and your opportunity to win more eyeballs, I think, is there.
Okay, David, and also you might want to add on to that, David, what happens if you don't update?
Well, if you don't update, you really run the risk of being completely irrelevant. When we think through all the different points that were discussed during the presentation, I mean, that's really a checklist of what you need to do. So if you have not already done that within your organization, gone through those different steps, I mean, a couple of years from now, it's going to be rather embarrassing, I think, because it's going to be static, it's going to be stale. boring in a lot of ways. You can just see the example of the total emotional feeling that's different with that brand, with those two brand examples that Paul shared. So, the emotional connection and the feelings that you receive or that you're having when looking at that old logo don't even come close to what is there with the new one. Same with the website as the example. I mean, that is a beautiful, structure of how your site should be. And so if your site isn't like that, well, I would highly consider changing things around.
Totally agree. We're actually on our 4th site, so keeps me young.
Yeah.
What tips would you have for writing better messaging? Todd, do you want to start with you?
Sure. I kind of mentioned it already. I'm going to start. There's 2 ways to think about messaging in my mind. You can come top down, which is start with your mission and your strategies and kind of work backwards to the messaging. And you can also go bottom up, which is talking to your customers, talking to your prospects and understanding, and then bubble it back up. And hopefully those 2 things match. And I'm a big fan of talking to customers as a marketer or a salesperson and asking them, how did this resonate with you? Does this message or this topic resonate with you? I think the feedback, we kind of get in our bubbles, right? As marketing people sometimes, where we get stuck in our own head, and you really got to get out of your own head and get into your customer's head. So asking lots of questions, giving them opportunities to give you direct feedback, and then candidly looking at the data. You can monitor behavior to a very detailed level of people on websites, right? Looking at heat maps and recordings of people using your site. You can tell if your messaging is compelling. If nobody's working their way down a page or clicking through, it's not compelling. So use the data to drive your evaluation of your messaging. But the number one thing is really ask questions. Talk to your salespeople if you're a marketer. They have a lot of insight. Write an article, write a headline, and ask your salespeople, hey, does this work? Do you think that would fit with the people you talk to? And then really ask lots of questions and listen, really, really listen.
Thank you. David, do you have anything further to add?
Yeah, maybe just, I really think about, why should people care what you have to say? If your messaging, if you don't understand why people should care about it, then I feel it's always going to fall flat. And I like to think through messaging in terms of really the sales process, because typically, for a lot of manufacturers and industrial companies, there's all the leads come in, and then there's the RFP process, and back and forth, and that's what's considered sales. And I think that's somewhat of a limited scope in terms of how you need to have your messaging built. And I like to say it's more of what's your stadium pitch, okay? When you're talking about, when someone lands on your website, you're trying to keep the most amount of people there. And so if you get too granular with your messaging or too tight and specific with it, then the vast majority of people that are there are just going to click away. So you need your message to be relevant for the widest audience within your target audience. I'm not saying make it everything for everyone, but within your target audience, you're trying to keep 70, 80% of those initial people coming to your site or even interacting with your content there to be able to engage more. So think about why it's important. Where does this message fall within the overall sales process? And then how are you keeping the most amount of people interested to hear that next piece of what you have to say involved? I think those are really important steps when thinking through the content you're creating.
And David, how often do you think content should be updated for a manufacturer?
Well, I think certain things need to be updated more frequently than others. So obviously your homepage is kind of the water cooler, so to speak. So, the bulletin board, so things like that should be updated very often. But, your mission statement, I mean, that should be pretty standard. That shouldn't be changing all the time. So, I think that if the years go by and you reference how many years you're in business, well, that needs to be updated every year. Whereas, people come in to the organization, those things need to be updated. But you're creating, everyone should be creating ongoing content weekly. Some companies can do it daily within their blog just to be able to provide educational content. So if you're providing fresh education content there, then they're going to go to those other sub pages and other pieces of content within your site that maybe don't need to be updated quite as often.
Okay, thank you. Todd, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I always say that you determine your strategy, but your prospects and customers determine your tactics. You should never fall in love with tactics. You should use the tactics that work to engage and convert and interest your customers. So, and I think messaging is the same way. If you've got a seasonal product that has an impact based on the season or some kind of cycle, then you change your message to match that. Just look at your homepage. You can easily A/B test multiple messages on a homepage to see which drives more conversions or engagement. Again, so you don't fall in love with any one. Fall in love with the ones that work. And David's absolutely right. You need to keep things fresh and up to date. I mean, the last thing, little things like we notice things if you go on a website, you look in the footer and you see like a copyright. And if it's 3 years old, it's like, okay, so somebody's missing it. It's kind of a little thing. It's like Jessica was saying about grammar and spelling. I'm terrible at that. I wrote a book and I thank God for editors, right? Because I'm horrible at it. So I never proofread because I'm just not good at it. But you need to, the little things will matter. But I believe it's something that needs to be measured and it needs to be checked. And if it resonates and it's driving response and you can verify data against it, then keep it. And again, always update based on your customers. I don't necessarily think about a set time to change things. Like David said with mission, for me, a mission better be 3 to 5 years at least that you're going to run it, because if it can be changed that fast, it's not much of a mission. But once you get into the messaging around your service and the outcomes you deliver, if you deliver new outcomes and you're delivering new value to your customers, by all means, please incorporate that into your message, right? If you, like earlier you said, right, somebody said, if you stop selling a product, make sure it stays up to date. So again, I think it's all tactical stuff and it's kind of to be determined based on how often you would update it.
Thank you. In your experience, David, let's start with you. How can manufacturers best monitor customers' buying habits and build this into their messaging strategy?
Ooh, this is a good one. I think obviously there's a lot of technology that's available. So between your CRM, your marketing automation, so really your marketing stack of technology is able to, as Todd mentioned, track and be able to show you how people are engaging and using or engaging with your content. So I think that's a great way to do it. I think it's also just asking. One of my favorite things to do is just say, hey, so we've been talking for a while. What do you think IndustrialSage is? And I'm always surprised at everyone's response. And I kind of scratch my head a little bit like, oh, wow, okay, we need to tweak that. We need to update that. But I think it's really, in a lot of ways, simple. If you're sending out emails with your messaging in it and you're not getting responses, well, that's easy. Your message isn't working. And so, just the practical things, tracking that data. Some software does it for you automatically. HubSpot and Salesforce and, Adobe, all of those different marketing platforms can track your email messages, pull in how people are engaging and interacting with your content. So using that to collect the data, taking some time to analyze it, I think is very important.
Thank you. Todd?
I agree with everything David said, and I'm going to tell a little story real quick. I promise it'll be short, Sue. I once had a sales guy working for me as a VP of sales. We were selling equipment, manufacturing capital equipment. And I was working on this messaging question. And I said to my sales team, I'd like you all to go back to everybody you've sold in the last couple of months and ask them why they bought from us. I want to hear it from them. exactly why they bought from us. It was very instructive. We got lots of good feedback and a lot of things we didn't know, right? We didn't think about it, right? We didn't, parts of the process we de-emphasized were really important to the customers. Things we thought were really important really weren't. And I had one sales guy, he was a senior guy. He refused to do it. I kept asking him and asking him, and he wouldn't do it. I literally put him in a corner and I said, why aren't you asking this question? And he said to me, real sheepishly, he said, I'm afraid they're going to change their mind. So I think we have that attitude sometimes, right? They're going to change their mind about why are we working with them? Maybe this isn't such a good deal after all. I mean, that's such a scared way to look at it. But I think a lot of manufacturing companies think that way. Like, oh, I'm just glad it went out the door. I'm glad they got it. And you've got to ask that question. You've got to say, why did you buy from us? And then if you're working on new content or new messaging, you have good customers. Ask them, what do you think? Would you read this? Which of these headlines would attract you? Which of these messaging would fits, right? Test it. It's super easy to do, but it's so critical because those people are going to give you so much better feedback than you're going to get internally. So that's my biggest recommendation if you're trying to figure out how to monitor those buying habits. Beyond the data, there's tons of data. I love data. I love to see which pages people are looking at, which blog posts they're opening, which offers they download, right? You can get a lot of clues there, but nothing beats talking to them.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that concludes our panel discussion. We have a couple of questions here from our audience. So unless Paul or Jessica, you have anything to add, I'll move on to the Q&A.
So I just wanted to say, I thought those answers were great, and I agree with them. And thank you, David, for mentioning our work. And then Susan, congratulations on your new site launch. It looks great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I also thought we could do one more poll since we're a little ahead of schedule, and I'd send it out to everybody. So maybe I'll do that now and see how that goes. So this is going to be, do current events, right, here we go. Due to current events, has your company seen significant changes that will affect your future messaging? So maybe we'll see what people come up with for that. But yeah, if you want to, Jessica, unless Jessica has something to say.
No, again, thank you everyone for participating in the panel. And yes, thank you, David, for complimenting our work. Really appreciate that.
Point out where credit's due, you know, it's great work. So
Good content is king. That's our motto.
Okay, so the Q&A, I haven't been monitoring that, but I know we have a couple questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions here. So once you finish up with your poll, do you want me to go ahead with the Q&A, or do you want to announce the poll?
We can end that poll now. Okay. So the results I have here are 50% said yes, it has had an impact, the current events. 28% no, and 22% said not sure. So that was great. Nice to see everybody participating in that. So I think we can close that out and move along.
Thank you. Well, thank you, panelists. And now for the first Q&A from Rita. How do we differentiate our company in the new normal and speak to the different generations of influencers and decision makers? We are a custom manufacturer that has to speak to B2B customers in engineering and operations. And I'll open that up to the floor, whoever would like to comment first.
I can comment on that if you like. So one thing I noticed in the question, you mentioned B2B customers, and that's a pretty broad scope of market, business to business. If you can narrow that down, that's a big way to help with your differentiation. So the more you niche down into your market, even if you service everybody in B2B, which is fine, but if your marketing focuses in on a specific niche market, that's going to help tremendously. So narrowing that down into a specific industry of smaller groups, and you can have multiple groups to target would help a lot. So, you know, you talk about, you know, speaking to what different generations care about. I would think more in terms of what we talked about is thinking in terms of speaking to their needs, what they care about in terms of what you offer, and their pain points and what's their concerns. I wouldn't, certainly, there are certain things they take into mind. So some of the younger generations might care more about your mission and your vision. If you are helping any kind of situation, if you're helping a group or if you're helping the earth or something like that, they might gravitate towards you. They want to feel good about their purchases. But in general, if you're solving their problem and you're speaking to their issues, you're going to see more success. So I would worry less about the generational thing and more about narrowing down your target audience more.
Thank you. Todd, you wanted to contribute?
Sure. I would suggest that if you're talking about engineering and operations, there are two different types of people. They have two different outcomes. They have two different perspectives. And this would be a classic persona development where you would go in and understand from an individual person's point of view, what matters to them. I'll give you a quick example from a client we work with. They made a component that was part of motors, and they were stuck in the commodity, right? People would search XYZ part, and it would be 100 companies would show up. So how do you differentiate? And after working with them, we realized that what they really did well was the upfront engineering and design piece. They could go from concept to first prototype to runoff test quantities to production faster than anybody else. They weren't talking about it at all. They would talk about it when they actually got on the phone with somebody, and we decided to use that as their marketing. So we marketed to the engineers up front to differentiate what was considered a commodity component, because we were marketing the experience. We weren't marketing the part or the product. We were marketing the experience of working with them, that it was demonstrably different, measurable in time and money to engineers, because engineers were the ones that had to deliver, right? They would get compressed time schedules if somebody was late with a component or a drawing. The one piece missing, the whole thing couldn't get tested, right? So it would put their launch behind. So we spoke to the engineers about the experience of working with them, and they took off, right? Because they were able to differentiate, not on the part, not on the quality, not on the size, shapes, even the price. They would pay the price to avoid the delays, because it would put their contracts with their customers behind, right? So think about the experience that engineering and operations people have to deal with your product, and how you can make that better and market that. And I think you're really going to stand out, because the vast majority of manufacturing companies today still market product. They still say, I sell this part, or I sell this machine, or I sell this service. They don't say what the outcome is of that service or the experience of working with you. And I would argue that the customer experience you deliver from first touch through long life, long relationship, that experience is the key differentiator for most manufacturing companies. And most of them don't even recognize that. If you're competing on price or product or specs, you're just one of 1,000 that anybody can find with a simple Google search, right? I want to step out of that and say we're different, and experience, relating to the experience of an engineer or people then after the fact when they're in operations working with you. Why is that different? Why is it better? Why should I pick you versus anybody else? Because now I can separate from the pack and say, I'm not just a part, I'm not just a price, I'm value, right? So it makes that conversation different. So that's my short speech on differentiation.
Very valid point. Thank you. David, do you have anything to add?
No, I think we can go on to the next one maybe.
Okay. And we have from Mike, what are some practical and useful online tools options to attract potential customers? And does the panel have thoughts on tools like ThomasNet and Hoovers? David, do you want to start with that one?
Just in terms of tracking customers or finding customers, is that the question?
Yes, practical and useful online tools to target and attract potential customers.
Well, I think that something that's gaining a lot of traction that only a handful of manufacturers are leveraging right now, or even industrial companies right now, would be account-based marketing. And so that's something like a Terminus, where you can plug in exactly what accounts you want to target, or even put in, create lookalikes based on different criteria, and be able to find them that way. where you're really leveraging the might and power of all these different social platforms that are gathering data and information, and use that to find your target customers. I think in a lot of ways, you know, when you're producing content and putting it out on, you know, third-party sites for the validation aspect, you really just want to talk to a fraction of that audience, and so it's sometimes a challenge to be able to get that message in front of, you know, everyone that you're trying to reach. So I think that's where you know, different targeting tools can really help streamline that process. But you can even do it with LinkedIn. You don't need necessarily a terminus to be able to accomplish that, per se.
Todd, you're nodding. Do you want to have any?
I'm a huge fan of Terminus, great product, and other buyer intent tools are gaining traction. There's Bombora, Zoom Info has an option for it. Again, the idea here is that you're identifying people that are looking for you, that are looking for solutions like yours. The question mentioned ThomasNet and Hoovers, and there's some usefulness there. I mean, Hoovers to me, spray and pray, right? I'm going to download a bunch of names and contacts, and if I'm going to spam them, good luck. I don't think that works real well anymore. I mean, I always say to my clients, like, do you like getting those emails? And the answer is universally no. And then it's like, well, why would you do that to your prospects, right? And ThomasNet is interesting. They've got some new products and new services coming out, but at the end of the day, it's still pretty much a big online marketplace with lots of people listed. So if you're willing to spend the money, right, you can stand out there. But again, I tend to feel like that's more kind of parts and pieces and components. And if you have more of a complex sale, I think the ratio, the more complex your sale get, the less those types of kind of online marketplaces are valuable. But I'm a huge fan of CRMs that can give you really good data. Like I use HubSpot CRM, and I can see exactly what my prospects are doing. I can see which emails they opened, which pages they went to. Just really basic information like that. I don't see a ton of manufacturing salespeople using that data, but I mean, simple things like saying, I have this page for XYZ service, and I'm going to have a running list of all of my prospects that visited XYZ page, and then maybe reach out to them with some custom content. I mean, even basic things like that really make a difference. And again, I'm a big fan of getting good at those basic tools first, and not chasing the shiny thing, which is like the newest app that shows up, the newest, you know, look for tools that are proven, that are used widely, and that are additive to your sales process. Because the last thing you want to do is add a tool to your sales process and then have your salespeople not use it, and then you lose credibility, and it kind of wastes everybody's time. So start with the basics. You know, get that basic prospect data down. Again, LinkedIn Sales Navigator is amazing. There's a lot of value there, and then look at some of the more in-depth ones like Terminus, which is one I'm a big fan of. But yeah, get the basics down first and then go from there.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to add anything at the end?
Well, I was going to definitely jump on to, first off, I thought the other two answers were really great and thorough. To add to Todd, Sales Navigator of LinkedIn is definitely, what I like about it is it's very up to date and current. What I found my experience with Hoovers, I don't have experience with Thomas, although I do know it well, but with Hoovers and any one of those kind of lists, they tend to be outdated. So you have to expect, I don't know what the percentage is, but I found 30–40% of the list seems to be outdated and irrelevant, and bounces back. And now with current events with the pandemic, so many people are out of work that those lists will probably come back significantly shorter than they were before. So I would caution people to use that. I actually don't send people towards those list makers at all. I think if you're doing your content marketing right, people come to you. It's great if you want to utilize one of those things to get out to a bigger audience. But if you start emailing them, I agree with Todd. Nobody wants spam. Nobody wants to be added to a list that they didn't sign up for. So you're better off creating useful educational content that they want and search you out for than you are hunting down lists and so forth. I do want to mention two things. I think David has something to say, but I want to mention two things. If anybody has more questions, don't forget to use the Q&A feature of the Zoom, just so you can add your extra questions in now. And also, don't disappear if, what's that? Oh, I thought somebody said so. Don't disappear just because of the Q&A is over. We have an after party after this, so we're going to send the link up after our Q&A. So just wanted to remind everybody about that. David, it looked like you might want to say something else, or maybe that was in your studio, or Jessica, if you had anything.
This is my part of the learn for the lunch and learn, so I just jotted down notes of what everyone else said. So yeah, thank you. I would just reiterate what Paul said about, letting your content go to work for you, making sure that you're always putting out valuable content and just using it to position yourself as the subject matter expert.
Oh, another place that sorry, Susan. Another place that I love getting contacts from, if you want to, is so say you narrow down your niche market, you can look within associations that they might belong to. So if you're a manufacturer that specializes in medical devices, there's so many associations for medical device companies. You can join, or some of them have their directories right on their website without joining, and you have access to all their contact information sometimes. And that's usually pretty up to date because they update that annually. But more importantly, it's just it's targeted and niche, so therefore it is the person you're supposed to be talking to, and they're going to be a lot less likely to feel like it's spam because it's actually relevant to them. So that's something I would recommend there.
Thank you. Well, I think that concludes our Q&A. I think we've covered everything that everybody's asked. Paul, you're going to put up the link for the after party if anyone wants to join, is that correct?
Absolutely.